Hi and welcome to lesson 6. In the previous lesson, you learned how to write some basic Swift code. Well, let me ask you something. How does a user usually interact with an app? Well, it's usually they tap on something on the screen, let's say a news headline, and then the app gives a reaction, such as showing that news article. Action and reaction. Well, that implies that when the user takes an action, depending on what that action is, the app needs to react accordingly and run the appropriate block of code depending on what the user is doing. So we need a way to organize our code into bite-sized chunks so that when the user takes this action, we run that chunk of code. And when the user takes that action, we run that chunk of code. Well, Swift has something called a function, and this is basically a block of code where you wrap it up with a name, and when you want to run that block of code, you can just call it by its name. So that's what you're going to learn how to do today. Let's roll. Alright, so we're going to create a brand new playground here, and we're going to try out these functions. So let's get started with the playground. Under iOS, let's choose blank. And I'm just going to save it on my desktop and call it my playground 2. Alright, so we're going to just go down here, create a new line, and we're going to type in func space. Now that keyword is used to declare a new function. The next part of the function is the name of the function. Now this is important because whenever we want to run the code that is inside this function, we're going to call it by this name that we're going to give it right now. So I'm going to call this function say hello. Now the next part of the function is a pair of rounded brackets. So find that on your keyboard. Typically it's right above the 9 and the 0. So you're going to have to hold down Shift and you're going to type those two rounded brackets. Now inside those rounded brackets, right now we're not going to put anything in there, but you can have something called parameters, which is something you're going to learn a little later in this lesson. Alright, now next we're going to hit space and we're going to open up a pair of curly brackets, or squiggly brackets, some people call them, and you got to find these on your keyboard too. For my keyboard layout, it's above the square brackets. So I'm going to hold down Shift and type in a pair of squiggly brackets or curly brackets. Go inside it and press Enter a couple of times to create a few lines. You're going to write your code for your function in between these two curly brackets. Think of it as the guts of the function. So whenever you call say hello, the code in between these curly brackets, it's going to get run. I'm going to print out in here hello. All right. Now let's go outside of the function. And by outside, I mean after this ending curly bracket, we're going to just call the function by its name, say hello. And notice that autocomplete already brings this up. But let's type it out just for extra practice. So we're going to use the name of the function followed by the curly brackets. All right, now let's run this line of code. You'll see down here, it's going to execute this print statement and it's going to print out hello. And if you don't have this tray at the bottom, you can open it up like that. When you write a function, you're usually writing some code to perform a specific task. In our example before, you wrote a function to display the full article. And when the user taps on a news headline in the app, you're going to call that function to display the full article for that headline. Now, let me present another scenario. What if there are 10 news headlines in your news app? Are you going to write 10 different functions, one to display the full article for each headline? Of course not. Furthermore, the news changes every day, so you wouldn't be able to write a function to show a news article that hasn't happened yet, right? Instead, you're writing a function to do the work to present and display a full article to the user. That function doesn't care or doesn't know about what sort of article it's going to be presenting and displaying. You as the coder basically pass that information into the function when you call that function. You can do this with something called function parameters. Remember those rounded brackets in the function call? Well, you can specify the parameters in between those rounded brackets that indicate what sort of data you're passing into the function when you're calling it. In the example below, we declared a function called say hello to. In the rounded brackets, you have a parameter called name, and it's of the data type string. Now that kind of looks like a variable declaration without the var keyword. Whenever you call the 𝗧𝗩𝗺_to function, you're going to have to supply a piece of string data into that function call. Now let's jump back into our playground and see this in action. All right, before we jump into an example with parameters, let's first add a comment up here and just call this a basic function. Remember, this is something you should get into the habit of doing. And I also want to show you, if it wasn't clear, how to use the autocomplete feature, because trust me, you're going to be using it a lot. So why don't I type say hello? You're going to notice that it pops up right here. Now you can either hit enter right now, or you can press up and down on your keyboard to select a different one, and you can even use your mouse and you can scroll down the list. And so here I'm just going to double click it. All right, so now let's do a function with parameters. So again, we're going to type in func space for declaring a new function, and this time I'm going to call it 𝗧𝗩𝗺_to, and we're going to specify the rounded brackets just like before, except that this time I'm going to move my cursor inside the rounded brackets and we're going to put a single parameter in here. Let's call this parameter name : we're going to specify the data type. It's just like almost like declaring a variable like we did in the previous lesson. All right, so now we're going to open up a pair of curly brackets and we're going to add some space in there. And here we are going to print out the name that gets passed in. And the way you can do that is just by referencing that parameter name. So since we called it name, we can just say print name. So whatever data gets passed into this function when it gets called, we are going to be printing it out into the console. So right now, even if we run the code, it's not going to do anything. We actually have to call the function. So here, below the function, let's type in say, and you can see that now autocomplete shows you this second function that we just wrote. So go ahead and select that and press enter. And this highlighted blue part is telling you that you need to specify a piece of string data along with this function call. So why don't we go ahead and type in Tom there, and then let's run this line of code at this point. So you're going to see Tom there, right? And that's just a result of us passing this piece of data into the 𝗧𝗩𝗺_to function. So that's going to come in through here, and then it's going to take that string data and print it out to the console. And that's why we get this result down here. Now, what if we wanted to say hello Tom instead? Well, we can do that, and I'm going to show you a really neat way to do that. So let's erase this name here, and instead let's print out a string called hello space. And we can actually insert that name parameter into the string. And the way you do that is backslash, and then type in a pair of rounded brackets. And inside the pair of rounded brackets, you would just put the name of your parameter or variable or whatever you want to insert into the string. Now let's run this function call again. Now you get hello Tom. Now in this example, we've done one parameter. You can actually include multiple parameters into your function. All you would have to do is inside the rounded bracket, after the first parameter, just type in comma, and now you can require a second parameter. So let's make this one age, and this data type for the age is going to be an integer. So immediately the playground is going to complain that this function call is no longer valid, and it's right. It's missing an argument. It's missing this parameter called age. So what I'm going to do is just completely get rid of this line, and we're going to type in say, and you can see here that autocomplete has detected we've changed that function. So let's double click it or press enter, and we're going to fill in the parameters that are needed. Now here's a neat trick. As you're filling in the parameters here, if you press tab on your keyboard, it just automatically jumps to the next parameter that you need to fill in. So that's a shortcut that's going to help you. So let's type in something like 20 years old, and let's run this code. Now again, it just says hello Tom because we haven't included the age parameter in this print statement. So why don't we modify this piece of text? You are backslash, rounded brackets. Let's insert that age, years old. And now let's run this function again. And now you're going to see down here, hello Tom, you're 20 years old. Now you can actually specify more parameters, but I wouldn't go too crazy with this. In the future, as you're going to get more advanced with Swift, you're going to learn ways to combine pieces of data together into one parameter. And so you don't have a long parameter list that you're going to require. But for now, if you wanted to include 2, 3, 4, 5 parameters just to play around, feel free to do so. It's going to be good practice. There's one thing that I want to mention, and that is that you can actually omit these parameter names right here. So it's going to, I guess, save you a little bit of typing. Sometimes it can be nice to have them so that it's really clear what sort of data you need to pass in. But let me show you how you could do a function call where you can omit this. All you would need to do is back in your function declaration here, you would just include an underscore space in front of that parameter. So we're going to do the same thing with the age here. And then we're going to get rid of this line. In fact, Xcode is now, or Playground is now telling you that you don't need these things. So let's get rid of this line and again use autocomplete, and you can see there's our function. Visually here it doesn't look any different, but if you press enter you can see that this whole thing is highlighted now. And when you add your parameters, right, it's just gonna look like that for your function call. So what you're actually doing here by adding this underscore is you're omitting something called the argument label. Now I'm not gonna get too much into it right now because I don't want to confuse you with a lot of knowledge that you don't need right now, but just know that that's something that you can do. I will link to some resources in the description if you want to read more into it. But if even if you don't, as you're going to get a little more advanced with Swift and you're going to learn more about functions, you will come across this knowledge anyways. So it's nothing that you need right at this moment. Now you know how to write functions which expect some sort of input data to work with. Another great use of functions is to take that input data, process it, and transform it, and then return it back to us. Now functions can do this using the return keyword. In the function below, it takes an integer input, it adds 4 to it, and then it returns the result back to us. Now notice that after the rounded brackets, there's an arrow followed by the data type int. Now this describes the type of data that the function will return when you call it. Now let's go back to our playground and we'll try this out. All right, so now let's try out a function with the return value. So why don't we just type in a new comment here with return value. And I'm going to create a new function by typing func space, and then I'm going to call this function add 4 to, and you guessed it, we're going to add a parameter in here. I'm going to call the parameter x, and it's going to be an int data type. And here is where we get to the return value part. So we're going to type in a dash, a greater than sign, space, and here we indicate the data type of the value that is going to get returned by this function. So since we are simply taking in an integer and we're going to add 4 to it, it makes sense that what we're returning out of this function is also an integer. So that's what we type in there. And then we are going to hit space and write in our curly brackets there. Now I'm going to open up the curly brackets a little bit so we can type some code in between them. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a brand new variable here. Let's just call this sum. And sum is going to be equal to x, which is the value that gets passed in, that integer. And we're going to add 4 to it. Now, from here you can see that the playground is complaining that we're missing the return in a function that is expected to return an int data type. And it's right, because we need to return this sum. The keyword that we use is actually just return. So type in return space, and we are going to pass back the sum. So if you let Xcode run, or maybe you can run your code at this point, you're going to get rid of that error. So let's try this out. Let's try calling this function. add 4, and autocomplete brings it up. Let's hit enter. Here we're going to pass in, let's say 10. Let's go ahead and run this function at this point. We don't really see anything. I mean, you see the result in the preview here, but like I said, we're going to pay attention to the console. Nothing gets output here. Well, where did that 14 go, right? What's actually happening here is it's passing in 10 into this function, right, through this parameter. Then it's adding 4, and then it's returning the sum. And we are actually responsible for capturing that data. So in fact, what we have to do here is we have to type in var, let's say result equals the execution or the return result by executing this function. So if we print result and we run this code, we're going to see 14 down there in the console. So just to run it through one more time, what's happening here is we're executing this function, we're passing in 10 as a parameter, then this code inside this function gets run, right? It's going to take 10, which we passed in, it's going to add 4 to it, it's going to assign it to the variable sum, and then it's going to return the data sum, right? And that's going to come back here, and that sum gets assigned to result, and we're printing the result. Now, one question you might be asking yourself now is, why do I have to use return values? Why do I have to use this return keyword here? Why can't I just access sum right here? Why can't I just say print sum? So why don't you go ahead and try that and run your code, and you're going to get an error that says use of unresolved identifier sum. And if you scroll up here, that's the same error message, but it's basically saying that it cannot find anything called sum. Well, what do you mean? We have sum declared right here inside this function. This brings me to my next topic, which is variable scope. You see, the code that is inside this function right here is inside of its own scope. So any variables you declare in here only exist within that function. And that's why in order to get that data out, you have to use the return keyword. What I find helps beginners to grasp this concept is by thinking of the code inside of the function as existing in its own little bubble. So anything that, the code that you write here, the variables that you declare inside that function is in its own little bubble, and in order to get that data out, you're going to use the return statement here. Now, another thing I might add is that each function has its own scope or its own bubble. So if I, let's say, declared another function, let's just call this C, and I try to print sum in here, I'm also going to get an error, right? Because sum exists in this function's scope. I can't access it anywhere else. Each function has its own variable scope. Now, I know this variable scope concept is a little bit abstract, but what's going to happen is that as you're writing more Swift code and you're building your apps, you're going to run into issues where you're trying to access this variable inside the scope, and then you realize that you can't, and it's just something over time that you're going to realize, and it's going to click if it hasn't already clicked for you. So I guess what I'm saying is that give it some time, and don't worry if it's kind of confusing to you right now. What I'm saying is that as you're writing more code and you're building more apps, you're writing more functions, these things are going to fall into place for you. So let's erase that test function, and let's address this thing. It's so annoying. This variable sum was never mutated. Consider changing to a let constant. So this goes back to what we talked about in the previous lesson. When should you use variables and when should you use constants? Well, I told you that you should default to using constants, and then if you find out that you need to change up that data and you get an error to say that you can't change it up, then you can consider changing that let to a var. using a variable instead. So here, Xcode is warning you that, hey, you declared sum as a variable, but in fact, after you've assigned some data to it, you never ended up changing it. So why not use a constant? And so Xcode is being very helpful, not annoying, in fact. Let's change that to a let, and we're all good. Now, before we jump to the next lesson, one last thing about autocomplete. So I want you to notice when we typed in add 4 to, this right here, this is the return value. So when you're looking through different functions to call, this is very handy to understand what sort of data this function returns. What happens if we try to now call one of these guys, say hello to, or say hello? In fact, these guys, they don't have return values, right? So what happens when we try to autocomplete that? Well, it says void. Well, void basically means no return value. So that's what it means. And why? Why does void say that? Because in fact, let's go back to the basic function here. In fact, right here, the return value is actually void. It's just that we don't have to type it when it's void. So you can actually specify a return value of void, which is basically no return value, and you don't need a return keyword. So that's just a neat little fact, right? When you don't need a return value, you don't need to specify this part of the function declaration. You can kind of omit it. But the interesting part is when you use autocomplete to call this function, it still says that the return value is void. All right, so today you learned about how to organize code into functions. You've learned about input parameters, which let you supply functions with input data. You've also learned about return values, which let functions return data back to us. And finally, you've learned about variable scope, which is basically all of the variables and code inside of a function only exist within the scope of that function. Believe it or not, there's still a lot more to functions, but what we've covered so far is more than sufficient for now. Now I've got a worksheet for you to practice and solidify what you've learned. You can grab it by clicking the card over there or checking the description below. Now I want to turn it over to you. We're 2 lessons into Swift with 1 more to go. Do you feel like you've got a grip on things so far? Let me know below by saying yes or no. Now, if you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel by hitting that subscribe button below, and also click on that bell notification icon if you don't want to miss the next episode. Now go ahead and click on that thumbnail over there, and I'll see you in the next lesson.